Hello, my name is Melinda, and this is a very meaningful presentation for me. So it's also very personal. I grew up in Brooklyn and single parent, low income, and by the time I was 16, my father and I moved into our 5th apartment. So definitely a lot of turbulence and lack of stable, affordable housing. I'm lucky now to be living in a rent-stabilized apartment. It's amazing. It's the most stable situation I've ever lived in. But that whole journey that I've been on really led me to wonder, like, what is the infrastructure here? Like, first I wanted to kind of tackle the situation and say, what can we do? And then when I explored the issue, I was like, wow, this is really complicated. So in part, this is like my own way to like figure out what's going on and then help share that information with other people who also want to make a better, situation. So with that, we'll jump in. And I'm going to speak for a little while, so I hope you don't get tired of my voice. And then I'll pass it off. Okay, so to start things off, as many of you know, New York City faces a housing crisis. The population of the city has grown steadily since the 1980s, and with the financial crisis of 2008, development slowed, causing a housing shortage. One stat that illustrates this is that from 2011 to 2017, there was a massive population increase of 250,000 people and only 100,000 new units. So with that demand for housing increasing, rents have also gone up, leading to gentrification, the displacement of low-income New Yorkers. So affordable housing is in high demand, and we're going to try to talk about the infrastructure in place for affordable housing. So federal housing programs. All right, so let's do a little poll. What percentage do you guys think of New York rentals are federally subsidized through public housing and Section 8 housing? So A, 3%, just raise your hands. Okay, B, 12%, C, 16%, and D, 7%. The answer is 12. So much of that is run through NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority. So that's funded by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they run the largest public housing and Section 8 programs in the US. 1 in 14 New Yorkers, 7% of the population, lives in a NYCHA-administered apartment. NYCHA housing programs are currently at capacity, and there's really lengthy wait lists, so it's not really something you could get in on unless you're already on that wait list from like 5 years ago. So public housing, aka the projects. Tenants pay 30% of their income towards rent. Tenants' incomes are 80% or less of the area median income, and we'll get into that later, what that means. But basically it's a measure of what people make, like what their incomes are. So in New York City today, for a family of 3, the income limit to live in public housing would be $68,700. So more than 400,000 New Yorkers reside in public housing, and that's 326 housing projects in the city, 178,000 apartments. It's a lot of numbers, sorry about that. So Section 8 there's 2 different kinds of Section 8 housing. One is the housing choice vouchers, which are portable. That means you can bring it from one private apartment to another private apartment. Like you basically hook it up with your landlord, they'll take your voucher, and the voucher pays for 30 to 40%, recipients pay 30 to 40% of their income towards rent, and the voucher covers the rest. So that's about 100,000 apartments in New York City with 235,000 New Yorkers in them. And recipients' incomes are less than 50% of the area median income. So for a family of 3, that's about $43,000. And as you can see with the pie chart, it's about like 23% elderly, 20% disabled, 36% adults with children, like families. Anyway, we'll send you this presentation so that you can look at all the details on your own. So the other kind of Section 8 is project-based, and that's not run by NYCHA, that's run straight from federal through the U.S. HUD. And yeah, basically the tenant has to stay in the project in order to receive the Section 8 voucher. And about 2/3 of those recipients are seniors or disabled, and that's about 90,000 apartments in New York City. So a little bit less than the portable vouchers. So some of the limitations of federal housing programs are that it excludes undocumented immigrants and ex-convicts, and unfortunately there's just not a lot of funding for it, so about 3 out of 4 low-income tenants in the US don't receive assistance, and about 63% of the households who don't receive assistance have children or are headed by elderly or disabled person. So as you see from this chart, there have been sharp cuts in federal housing funding over the years. It just keeps going down. And as a result, NYCHA is in crisis. So this past winter in public housing, we've seen widespread lack of heat and hot water, plus lead in the pipes. It's been a huge controversy in the city, and basically the Citywide Council of Presidents of NYCHA Residents Associations, aka like the tenant leaders of NYCHA public housing, they're calling for an official state of emergency. Mayor de Blasio blames the lack of federal funding for the issue of old boilers not getting repaired and old buildings not getting repaired. Governor Cuomo has approved $250 million in state funds to help NYCHA, but the funds have not passed through the state legislature yet. So it's very unfortunate. On to the next topic is rent stabilization. So another question for everyone. What percentage of New York rentals do you think are rent stabilized? A, 18%. All right, B, 45%. C, 26%. And D, 38%. All right, it looks like a lot of people thought C, but in fact, B, I think it was more like 43%, but in any case, somewhere around there. Almost half of New York City rentals are rent stabilized. That's about 990,000 apartments with 2.6 million people. And while that's a lot, it's actually decreased a lot in the last 10 years. It's decreased by 15% in the last 10 years. So 172,000 apartments were deregulated in the last 10 years. And the way that works is that when rents hit a certain threshold, they can go market rate. And so basically that's huge. Like landlords want that to happen because they'll make more money if the apartments go on market rate. So currently that threshold is $2,733.75, and we'll get to how that number came about soon. So rent stabilization is a program that started in 1969, and New York City buildings with 6 or more apartments built before 1974 became rent stabilized. Some other units were rent controlled, which is kind of complicated, but rent controlled apartments end up graduating to rent stabilized. So anyway, since 1969, the Rent Guidelines Board, which is appointed by whoever's mayor, decides on the annual rent increases for stabilized apartments. And originally there was no rent threshold at which they came out of the rent stabilization program. But basically because of conservative politics, things changed. The program got really limited. And part of that is because the legislation got moved largely to the state level, where a lot of state legislators don't have rent-regulated constituents, because this is like mostly a New York City program that became run by the full state. So basically, a lot of upstate legislators became subject to like the New York City real estate lobby. You know, they're more swayed by the lobby than by the constituents. They don't have constituents who are rent stabilized. So basically, under governors Mario Cuomo and George Pataki, we had the introduction of the rent threshold at which apartments become destabilized. Currently it raises under current Cuomo. That threshold raises with the percentage of how much the leases go up. So like last year, the leases went up 1.25%. So that's how we get this weird number of $2,733.75. So that's the current threshold, and that'll continue to go up along with the leases. However, the rent guidelines board decides that those go up. Sorry if that's a little complicated. There's now a vacancy bonus, so basically landlords are like incentivized to push tenants out. Like when a tenant moves out, the rent increases by 20%. Preferential rents is a huge issue. There's a lot of people paying less than the maximum, and currently a landlord can just bring them up from the preferential rate to the maximum rate at their whim. That could be like $1,000 increase, and they're allowed to do that. Developers can buy stabilized tenants out, which could be like a $10,000, $20,000 deal, but you have to wonder if is that worth it in the long run. And then succession rights were also lost for like nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles. So currently, yeah, as I mentioned, there was a 2-year rent freeze on rent stabilized apartments, and now they're going up by 1.25%. And now we're going to segue into a new part of the presentation. De Blasio has a program called Housing New York, and they aspire to, among other things, to protect rent stabilized apartments. Okay, so Housing New York, de Blasio administration plans to build and or preserve 300,000 affordable housing units by 2026. So here are 4 programs that are part of Housing New York. And the first one is the Neighborhood Pillars program, which is a public-private fund that is trying to fund nonprofit organizations to acquire rent-stabilized buildings and market-rate buildings in order to preserve their affordability, to get the sort of profit motive away from the landlords so that they don't kick the tenants out. So the goal is to preserve 7,500 affordable units over 8 years through this program. And yeah, there's been a lot of tenant harassment and speculation in gentrifying neighborhoods, so this is a program that's like trying to combat that. Okay, I'm finally done with my portion.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm here to talk about the Affordable New York Housing Program. So this is a piece of legislation that gives building developers a tax break in return for a couple of things. Fair wages for construction workers, number 1, and number 2, if they designate 25 to 30% of their building as affordable housing units. And kind of like, how is that affordable unit decided, and who gets to stay there? It's mainly decided by the area median income, which we briefly talked about later. Does anyone have any idea what the area median income is for a New Yorker? And this is not only New York, this is actually New York, Westchester, Putnam, and Rockland counties. So that might affect your answer. Okay, A. B. C. D. Okay, yeah, so this is the single area median income for one person in New York. This is kind of a chart just to see the family size down here and what the area median income is, like the percentage of the area median income in different levels. And again, we'll send you this presentation if you want to look at these numbers in detail. Yeah, so in 402-1A and the Affordable New York Housing Program, developers have 3 options in choosing how they want tenants in their building. And if you notice, in all 3 options, they can choose, or all 3 options have levels of AMI 30% above the AMI, which is actually a 6-figure salary. So don't know really how affordable some of the options are, which is kind of crazy. So there are definitely differing opinions on this piece of legislation. I'm going to pass it over to the next.
How's everyone doing? Okay, so we are going to talk briefly about mandatory inclusionary housing, or MIH for short. So who's familiar with MIH, or who's heard of it? Okay, great. So it's a pretty progressive program, and it's putting New York at the forefront of progressive housing policy, but it has some caveats. So essentially what it is in certain developments, developers are actually required to allocate 25 to 30% of those new apartments to low-income families. And in the first year, in 2017, MIH already built 1,600 permanent affordable units. And so the beautiful thing about this program is it is permanent, both permanent and affordable. So landlords can no longer, and developers can no longer change those levels to make them less affordable. And so in the past, New York City actually had a voluntary inclusionary housing, meaning they were trying to give incentives to developers to allocate more affordable housing. But now it is completely permanent, and the only other comparable mandatory programs are in San Francisco and DC, which are significantly less in terms of percentage allocation. So the nuts and bolts. So essentially, going back to this idea of AMI. So 25%. So there's basically two ways you can do it. It's 25% or 30% of the whole building has to be allocated towards low-income housing. So if 25% of it, then at least 60%. You're living, most of the families that are getting it have 60% AMI, and if it's 30%, then they have 80% AMI. And so it's already being developed here in Williamsburg itself. So I personally live in Williamsburg, and some of you may have heard of the Broadway Triangle. It's a contentious issue, but it is the MIH program in action as well, because 25% of those apartments will be permanently affordable. And then those caveats that come with it, is 25 to 30% enough to actually be affordable? That's one thing. And then the other thing is, there's difficulty in meeting community needs, because the community boards can have contention with developers, even so, in actually representing the diversity in a community. And that is
All right, hello. So this on the screen is the ELA program. This is the final part of Housing New York that is within the de Blasio plan. So ELA stands for Extremely Low and Low Income Affordability. It's run by the New York City Housing Preservation and Development Department. And there are two options for building a building with this program. And so the first is that 10% of the units go to homeless families, and 30% of the units are affordable to extremely low and very low income families, making 30 to 50% AMI. And the second option is that 30% of units go to homeless families, while 10% of units go to affordable households earning between 40 and 50% of the AMI. Now we have more local affordable housing programs, so this is going to be like more specific to New York City than some of the earlier programs that Melinda talked about. So we have the Mitchell-Lama program. So Mitchell-Lama is a program that funds affordable rental and co-op housing for middle-income families. So during the 50s and 70s, developers, so people looking to build buildings, received tax abatements and subsidized low-interest mortgages and guaranteed return on investment in order to continue to develop affordable housing on city-owned land. But since 1989, New York City has seen 20,000 affordable Mitchell-Lama homes flip to the market rate. There are 45,000 homes left in this program, and there's a priority for the current administration and for us as housing advocates to preserve those homes as are and not allow them to flip to market rate. SCREE and DREE are two programs that are targeted towards senior citizens and disabled persons. And so SCREE stands for Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption, and DRE, Disabled Rent Increase Exemption. So it freezes rent for disabled and seniors who are 62 plus, who live in rent-regulated apartments. In order for this program to be accessed, the tenant's income has to be less than or equal to $50,000, and rents are greater than or equal to a third of their income. Landlords for this program are given a property tax abatement credit for the increase that the tenant is exempted from. But these programs are definitely beneficial to the seniors and disabled persons we have in our communities to make sure that they can stay in the homes that they are in. But unfortunately, it's not a super wide program. Okay, so rent control. Rent control was once more vast than it is today. Now there's about 27,000 rent control apartments left in New York City. In apartment buildings that were built before 1947, rent control applied to tenants who lived there since 1971 and all of their familial successors. Rents could only increase to cover maintenance or capital improvements to the apartment. And most of these tenants were elderly, and in addition, if they had the SCREE program, their rents could be frozen. As an example, Melinda's grandmother was paying $275 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in Midwood until 2012. Yeah, so that is a crazy low number for New York City rent, but that's just an example of how the program works to help someone who is part of our senior community afford their home. All right, and now, aside from everything else, there are unregulated apartments in New York City, as we know. And so, what percentage of New York rentals are market rate, do you think? Okay, A, 32%, B, 27%, C, 39%, and D, 51%. It's actually 39%, yeah, so less than half. It's actually less than the amount that are rent stabilized, which is 45. Yeah, so New York City, we have 850,000 rental units, so it's 39% our market rate. There is actually no lease required, which I found very surprising. Some of these apartments do have leases, some don't. And private landlords may raise rent without any regulation, and eviction processes are much swifter than in regulation apartments. And that is all she wrote. Yeah. We are going to invite up, Melinda to speak, and we're going to invite up our panelists.
I hope you guys learned things. And just to sum up about the overall, I'm sorry that there's not a slide for this, but so that's 45% are rent stabilized, 12% are federal subsidized housing, which includes Section 8 and public housing, and then 39% are market rate. So that's about, what was it, like 4 to 6% that are through these other programs?
Yeah.
But as you know, going into the future, as we lose rent stabilized apartments and as these other programs grow, those percentages will change. So anyway, let's have our panelists come up.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pass the microphone around to you guys. And the first question is, please introduce yourself, tell us your name and what kind of housing work you do and have done.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ana Rosa Granados, and I'm a fair housing advocate at Brooklyn Legal Services Corp A.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Adam Myers. I also work at Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A. We've got an office right down on Broadway at the south side of Williamsburg. We've also got offices in Bed-Stuy and Bushwick now. And I am a staff attorney in our group representation unit, which means I work for low-income tenant associations, throughout North Brooklyn.
Good evening. My name is Beverly Newsom. I'm the president of our tenants organization. And that's what we've done also on our community board. But mainly, we support our tenants. I help support our tenants in both the community board and in Ebbets Field.
Okay, so can you guys tell me what you think is missing from the affordable housing infrastructure?
Okay, that's a very big question. Regulations, I feel like the city is not really looking into how these developers are constructing their affordable housing buildings. Also, they're not really looking at the area. You know, a lot of these affordable housing buildings displace a lot of people in the community. Also, a lot of these affordable housing apartments isn't necessarily affordable. So yeah, I guess those are my issues.
I agree with Anna on a lot of that. I mean, I think one big answer to what is missing from our affordable housing regime is just money. The city and the state and the federal government do spend a large amount of money to provide for some of the housing programs that were discussed there, you know, supporting NYCHA, supporting the different Section 8 programs, the ELA program, SCREE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just not enough. The presentation, I think, did a really good job of highlighting how underfunded NYCHA is, for example, in terms of its capital budget. It's tens of billions of dollars underfunded compared to where it needs to be in order to properly maintain all these buildings. And as again the presentation pointed out, there's an enormous population living in NYCHA. I read recently somewhere that there are more people in NYCHA than there are in the city of Atlanta, which I thought was a striking idea. And so money, if we were willing to just invest more of it, would go a long, long way toward repairing the affordable housing that's falling apart, toward building new affordable housing that needs to be built. Or, you know, if we want to do what we've done with some of these programs and just have the private sector build the housing for us, then that money could go toward voucher programs or other sorts of credits that would allow us to get those otherwise private units into the hands of folks that couldn't afford to pay private market rents.
It's hard being third.
We should change it up.
Yeah, you go first.
One of the things I would say though is, even if we had all of the money, there is no oversight. Let's just say someone came from out of the world and they say, okay, we're going to write a check for all that you need. The reason we have preferential leases, the reason that we have MCIs, all those things, they're being in existence, there is not an amount of money to fix it. And wouldn't you guys say that? With preferential leases are uncontrollable. They're laying on top of a rent stabilized apartment. So you as a tenant rush to an apartment because you know that it's rent stabilized, but you get there and you have to sign, in order to move into that apartment, you have to sign a preferential lease. Now, all the privileges that you thought you were gonna have, you're not gonna have them. That's what a preferential lease does. You're not gonna have them because depending on your landlord, he or she can choose to make that preferential lease something that they can keep you from advocating for your rights with. They can keep you from going to tenants meetings with. They can do all of that because once they see you rallying, once you call 311, once you do an HP action, they use that as an instrument at the end, at the term of your lease, at your lease term. They can use that as a reason to increase your rent because every preferential lease does not get increased. I've seen preferential leases that as much as they go up as $35. But I've seen preferential leases go up $1,000 at the end of their lease term. So we have to do something about the laws also. So if we had the money, that's great. That's a huge start. But we need to do something about the rent stabilized laws, because being in a rent stabilized apartment is just that. You're in a rent stabilized apartment. If you're holding a preferential lease, you just will be in a market rate apartment, because that's exactly what it is.
Okay, so changing topics a little bit. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you all. Which affordable housing programs do you find most effective and or least effective?
Each one has its flaws, and I have to admit, I'm not proficient on all of them. But I must say, it seems as if when the Mitchell-Lama program was in effect, it had more things to help tenants grow families. You move in, like Evansville, for example, it was formerly a Mitchell-Lama building. And Evansville currently has tenants who've been there 1 year after it was built. They're now raising their grandkids. So we're talking 50 plus years ago. Some of the other ones, they have loopholes that landlords with good lawyers are able, the loopholes are bigger. Like I said, not any of the programs are perfect, but Mitchell-Lama's loopholes seem to be smaller. Everyone else's seem to be able to maneuver themselves around them, which makes the longevity in an apartment not quite as long, you know.
Yeah, I think I agree with your statement that a lot of these programs have really different pros and cons. I think, you know, I'm talking a lot about NYCHA, but when I reflect on the scope of what NYCHA represents, like a real attempt on the part of the city to house permanently this massive portion of their own population, it's just a really amazing achievement in a way. The downside now obviously is the fact that it's falling apart in a lot of ways, and due to this underfunding. So that's a big problem. One of the things, excuse me, one of the things that is interesting about rent stabilization, which is the sort of regulatory scheme that I deal with most, because most, or the greatest share of apartments in New York City are rent stabilized. One of the fun things about rent stabilization, if there can be such a thing, is that as opposed to NYCHA, it's not like there's a list somewhere listing every single NYCHA building and every single NYCHA apartment. Rent stabilization sort of gives a general description for a kind of apartment and a kind of building that's rent stabilized. And so landlords who do stupid stuff to their buildings can like trip and stumble into rent stabilization. If they have a 3-unit building, but they decide, I want to make more money here, so I'm going to illegally divide each of these 3 units into 2. Now I've got a 6-unit building. And if it was built before 1974, the rent stabilization law says that building is now rent stabilized. And so, in a way, you can sort of, through creative lawyering, which, you know, we try to do as much as we can, you can actually like invent rent stabilization out of nothing sometimes if you sort of argue the facts right. And so that's one that we have a lot of fun with, I think.
Yeah, fun. So yeah, I agree with, you know, rent stabilization. I believe it started with a good type of view and how to house people with, you know, house people of low income, and but they're not regulating a lot of these laws and pushing them. So yes, they are using loopholes in order to take advantage of this situation, but I do believe in what rent stabilization is out there for. This gives tenants a chance to live in a community where they cannot afford. Therefore, their children have a possibility to have a better education, to integrate in a community that could be diverse. But it's kind of biting us, in the butt right now. A lot of these landlords are money hungry, not really defending those in rent stabilization, like apartments. Another thing that I do like, in theory, but I've had clients with very horrifying stories, is HASA. I like these vouchers like Section 8, HASA. These help a lot of people, again, live in diverse areas where they cannot afford. But landlords are discriminating against them. They're like, I don't want Section 8. I don't want anyone who has HASA because that they have a negative impact, view on it. They're like, oh, you're a person of color or you're a sick person. I don't want you here. So yes, in theory, these things are good, but the city is not really defending them. They're giving them these chances, but they're not really helping them out, but yes.
So to continue on that topic, we can, I don't know. I was gonna ask a couple more questions and then go to the audience. But if you're feeling really eager.
Yeah, don't forget it. Write it down or something.
So you started talking about discrimination in affordable housing. So I want to know more about, can we talk about discrimination in affordable housing and what we can do to stop it? Or
We already have a good line on this.
I gotta be honest, I'm not a believer in external forces being able to stop an individual from being discriminated. I'm just not. I believe that you have to have the desire to do so. And usually people who began one way and transitioned to another way, there was something that affected them to the inner core of who they are. There wasn't someone who said, that's not a good thing, you really shouldn't do that. And they go, oh my God. There was an epiphany and now they're different. No, you have to, Melinda's asking me the question, that's not, either you are or you aren't. You want to or you don't. It's just, it's just that. And I had a teacher said one time, once you find an individual who has an issue with one thing, I prefer, women are this, they are sexist. They're usually some kind of otherist. So it's an internal thing. Choose it, don't choose it. Want it, don't want it. It's not something I'm gonna be able to say, something I'm gonna be able to do to make you change, So I guess.
Yeah, right. Well, so yeah, discrimination is something that we see a lot, but it can be hard to pick apart exactly how it's operating. A lot of the clients that we work with on the south side of Williamsburg or in Bushwick are tenant associations of like low-income Latino families who have been living in the neighborhood for 20 or 30 years, often in those apartments for 20 or 30 years. And we hear a lot from them that there is discrimination going on at this building because when somebody moves out, it's not another Latino family that moves in, it's some white roommates. When we've got the old tenants that have been there for a long time, they're just treated differently from the new white tenants. There's a different superintendent for the new white tenants, and their repairs always get addressed almost immediately, whereas we have to wait a long time for ours, and they're sort of crappy repairs. And in a way that's like obviously extremely discriminatory. We can sort of draw a line and say people of one race are treated this way, people of another race are treated this way. what's operating there at its heart sometimes is really just economics, right? Like, if the rent stabilized tenants who have been there for 30 years are paying $500 a month, and the new tenants who are maybe those units came out of rent stabilization through the different rules that we talked about before, maybe they're paying $3,000 a month for the same apartments in the building. It's easy to understand why there would be a financial incentive for a landlord to treat the $3,000 tenants with a bit more responsiveness than the $500 a month tenants that they know are basically captured by their low rents. They're going to put up with whatever you make them put up with. And so it's definitely like a disparate impact, as we say. It's not discrimination in the same way that you think about like deliberate redlining of the past or whatever. And there's another sort of discrimination, segregation fault line that is being talked a lot about in housing in New York City recently, about local community preferences. This is related to the mandatory inclusionary housing program and some of these new affordable units that are being created in these new developments. A lot of these affordable units have a community preference, which means if I build new affordable housing in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, for 50% of those, I'm going to give a preference to people that already live in Williamsburg, Greenpoint. And the reason we do this is because, well, it's the people that live in Williamsburg, Greenpoint that are going to feel that displacement impact by the gentrification that the new development's going to bring. And they're the ones that have to deal with the trucks and the dust and the noise of the construction. And so we want to compensate the folks that live right around there in some way by saying, we're going to give you like an advantage in this affordable housing lottery. But at the same time, if Williamsburg Greenpoint is 66% white and Brooklyn as a whole is much less white than that, you're perpetuating the sort of segregation that has happened over years and years and years because you're making this deliberate choice to give the people that are already here the ability to stay. And so that's another kind of sort of issue surrounding discrimination that we think a lot about.
So this is my specialty. I've been working in the fair housing department at my job for 2 years now, and I am actually appalled by how much discrimination there is. The discrimination that we see in our minds is blatant, like, I don't want you living here, you're Latino, you have too much people in your family, get out. No, it's more systematic. Landlords are getting savvier. They are not telling you, I want you out because you're Hispanic, or they basically harass you until you leave. They give you buyouts. They don't speak to you in Spanish. They put signs up only in English. These are systematic forms of discrimination which has happened in New York City since the beginning. Housing in New York City historically is discriminatory, like it's racist. The Fair Housing Act has not been implemented much. Right now, you guys know that Ben Carson is, taking some language out of the Fair Housing Act, which we've already had problems implementing. But yeah, there's loads of discrimination. People are getting displaced. People who are low income cannot afford anything around them anymore. People are not including them in these rezoning decisions at all. They're not asking the community, how would this impact you? How does this large building, only housing, like whatever, like people could afford it, will affect you. The way it affects them is that they need to move out. They're going through construction through harassment. They can't live peacefully in their homes, and they end up leaving New York. A lot of people of color are leaving New York, and another reason why that's happening is that a lot of people of color do not own property. And the main people who have owned property are the people who have had high income back in the day, which are not people of color because they weren't allowed to buy property. So this goes way back. And we are still dealing with severe discrimination, but it's more, again, systematic, and it's really hard to pinpoint. And it's our jobs to really figure out how this is happening and how we could stop it. And the way we could stop it is actually implementing these laws that we already have at hand. But yes, there's a lot of discrimination out there. And you could ask me any questions after about it.
Okay, thanks for bearing with my scripted questions. And now I'll open it up to the audience if you guys have any questions. I guess I'll...
I could just say it. What can we do as normal New Yorkers to, aside from individual like selfishness, like I always think like how can I get a rent control apartment or rent stabilized control apartment? What can we do as just laymen?
First of all, if you're in a rent stabilized apartment and you know it, please conserve it. I mean, just either go to DHCR and get your rent history. Just keep that apartment rent stabilized for someone who actually may need it, and obviously you're there, needing it as well, but we are here to preserve these apartments. A lot of these apartments are getting flipped. So a good thing is that mainly, especially if you live in Williamsburg, you might be in a rent stabilized apartment and you might not know it. So I would say please get your rent history and preserve these apartments that you guys are living in, because they're flipping it, and a lot of people in the end will not be able to afford anything around here. So that's one thing you could do. And another thing is please speak to your neighbors. The community is out there. Please reach your hand out because they have a lot to say. They've been here for a while. So yeah, just participate and talk.
The question was what can a normal New Yorker do to sort of advance the cause of affordability generally?
Yeah.
So I really agree with Anna's second point, which is, and I guess this is sort of an organizing event, so maybe everyone obviously agrees with this, but using sort of your voice and your privilege and your economic power and support of other New Yorkers who are struggling harder than we are to keep affordable housing is critical here. One of the things that we do with tenant associations that we work with when conditions of disrepair at a building get particularly bad is we help tenants go on rent strike. The tenants stop paying rent to the landlord, or they're not going to pay rent until the repairs get made, and they're going to, eventually be entitled to a rent discount because of the bad conditions they've had to live with. And it's one thing to go on a rent, say it's an 8-unit building and we're working with 4 of the tenants. It's one thing to go on a rent strike with 4 tenants who are paying $500 a month. It's not bad. That's $2,000 a month that the landlord's not seeing. But if you've got 4 other apartments there where there are wealthier people living, more recent tenants, they're each paying $3,000 a month. If they came in sort of supported in solidarity the rent strike that these other tenants are organizing, then doing the math in my head, what is that? That's $14,000 a month that the landlord's not getting. You guys have a sort of power because of your position that can really be helpful to others who don't have that. And I had another thought. Oh, the other thought is there was a good slide talking about how a lot of these decisions about rent regulation at this point are made at the state level. It doesn't make any sense. These are New York City programs. These are New York City residents that benefit from them, but they are state issues. The city council, even though it's overwhelmingly progressive, can only do so much to affect the laws governing rent stabilized apartments. These decisions are instead made at the state level, and at the state level, while we've got a pretty blue assembly, the Senate is held hostage by the IDC, the Independent Democratic Caucus Coalition? Caucus? Conference, thank you. So vote them out. is something that we can all do, right? Like if we had sort of good Democrats actually using their majority to do something on housing issues, we could make a lot of progress.
IDC, good point. Because we need to, let me start with the normal New Yorker part. Let me start with that. My sister would swear no New Yorker is normal. Let's start with that. But with that being said, I agree with my peer, because it's the not working together that's undermining the whole program. Because in our community, I live in Crown Heights, we have homeowners, renters, market rate, all in a 5-block radius. And what that does is individuals have their own agenda when not realizing, let's take a complex the size of Evansville. Let's suppose it became market tomorrow. The effect would resonate at least in a 10-block radius all the way around. The taxes would increase for the private homeowners. The market rate would be even more market rate. We just have to look at, because it is a bigger picture. Everybody's looking at their own little 4x4, but it is a bigger picture. So as quote unquote, just a normal New Yorker, we have to work together. Because everybody has, even though everybody goes, I'm a homeowner, I'm a renter, I'm a market rate tenant, I don't have to worry about anything, but you do. Because what the underlying tone is that the landlord is seeking to get the maximum amount of dollar. And if we're not working together as a unit, we don't know what the maximum amount of dollars are. We don't. We're looking at an apartment being $3,500 for a 2-bedroom, and we're going, okay, this is it. It can't go any higher. There are people paying $4,000 in other communities. So working together is a way to help slow it down. Will it solve it? We don't know. Not even a real estate agent right now can tell you that. But it will slow it down, because if a landlord feels that he or she is not going to get what they could get because we're working together, they don't want us to work together. They don't want us to, because it doesn't work for them. You understand?
So I just wanted to add a couple of things. In our handouts, the first bullet point is amiRentStabilized.com. Find out if your apartment or your neighbor's apartment is rent stabilized. And then I wanted to ask, how many apartments are there in Evansville?
1324.
So 1,324 apartments that you're the tenants association leader of.
Yeah,
pretty impressive.
You feel like that's because I don't really think about it. One of the things that Evansville, and right across the corner is a building called Tivoli. Tivoli's 33 floors. Evansville is 7 buildings, 25 floors and 22 floors. 2 buildings are 22. Most of the buildings are 25. There's 1 or 2 that are 23 floors. The largest building has 423 apartments in it. They're using Evansville as a precedent to build all surrounding buildings that height. When Evansville and Tivoli were built during a time where affordable housing was truly affordable, and that's a whole nother discussion that we haven't had, the definition of affordable, and that needs to be had also. But they're using it as a precedent for height. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Spice Factory on the corner of Montgomery and Franklin. A developer has purchased that building, and one of the buildings on that property, he's trying to make 38 floors. Right next to that building is Botanical Gardens. And when we talk about losing resources, if a shadow is cast on that garden, they're going to have to reconfigure it. So when we talk about development, it's not just about how much rent we're going to have to pay. Our quality of life could change in some areas where development's going on, because it's so much about the money that all the other things are being forgotten. quality of life, not just quality of life in our places. We're talking about in our area in a 5-block radius, we're going to be looking at a couple thousand people. To between the Q and the B and the 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. You're going to be, right now, those trains can run every 3 minutes and it's still 4 people deep during rush hour. It's no joke. They're not working on the infrastructure of that area. They're just working on the top of the ground, not under. So the normal New Yorker, chime in, speak about it. If you have leverage with someone, use it. An elected official, all of us know one. We need to push back on them because our quality of life is truly being affected in a major way. Yes, ma'am.
Are those meetings open to the public about selling?
Well, in our area, yes, because we have ULERT meetings and we have community board meetings. So the ULERT meetings are open to the community. They're all supposed to be because they're community board meetings. Now, unfortunately, because they're committee meetings, you can go in and you can listen, and at the end of, if the meeting's really short, or if you ask, you can act appropriately, because there are some people we have that don't act appropriately, but you can go in and wait for your turn. Yeah, right. You can go in and wait and follow the rules and be able to say what you need to say, because a lot of times the community board needs to hear what the community feels, because they can't make a decision just on their own. They need to hear what the community feels, because the community board could feel like right now there's a zoning that the Spice Factory that I was telling you about, they're going to have to increase the zoning from 7 floors to 38. But in order to do that, they have to go through the community. You understand? So the community board right now, the poll was taken and we're like, no, build as of right. And everyone's familiar with as of right, right? As of right is a term that in the city is private property. This is your property. You are allowed to build it 7 floors. There's not anything we can do about that. We can't control it. We can't stop you. Okay, right. Knock yourself out. But when you try to go beyond that, it's private property. But in order to go beyond that, you need someone else's chime in. You need the community boards chime in. You need the city councils chime in. You need the mayors chime in. All of those people need to chime in. And for you to go that high, you need them to chime in positively. If not any of these individuals chime in positively, you are not going to go that high. You're going to be able to build as of right because there's no control over that. It's private property, but that's all you can do. You understand? So that's why community boards need community input, because they need to hear what the board knows what they feel because they take a poll. But they need to know, because the board could say, no, we don't want it. And the community go, no, the building's going to be 50% truly affordable, 50% market. It's going to be union labor. So we want that. The community, okay. Because the board represents the community. So the community needs your input. You understand? Okay.
More questions?
Yeah, what advice would you give to somebody who's moving from another state to here? Because I'm trying to look at places so far. It's only day one in my
So, if you don't mind my asking, what state are you moving from? Oh God. You know what? One thing about moving to New York, and I'll say this, and you're going to have to get accustomed, if you're not already accustomed, to a roommate style, because you're moving by yourself or you're moving with family. Oh, okay. So flexibility would help. So everybody comes to New York, they want to move to Manhattan or Brooklyn because now Brooklyn's a brand. Let your focus be, I need to find an apartment I can afford. Start like that, okay? Because this is not Georgia. I mean, even though Georgia, but New York is a little more, okay? So just be flexible. Suggestion.
Yeah. No, people come into our office and they say, you know, you guys are housing lawyers. I'm looking for housing. And you say, that is not what we did. No. As a person like you who moved to New York from elsewhere a few years ago, the big thing that struck me is how much faster real estate works here than somewhere else. You know, I think my apartment in Boston or wherever, I think I probably signed a lease for it a couple of months before I wanted to move in. Whereas here, you know, call about it a couple weeks maybe before you want to move in and just act really fast. And so on the one hand, that makes it extremely stressful. But on the other hand, it means, you know, maybe there's another opportunity right around the corner. Like there's going to be a posting on Craigslist that's for an apartment that's coming open in 2 weeks, and snatch it up.
So I'm from here. I grew up in Queens, but I know how it is to find an apartment because my parents and I have moved a lot. So quite used to the market and how it works, but know your rights, first of all. You're moving into New York City, you need to know where you're standing and need to know your rights in this state because realtors will take advantage of you. You know, they'll be like, I want 20%, you know, for getting you an apartment. You need to know how much apartments are going for in every area of Brooklyn, every area in Queens, and every area in Manhattan. You need to know whether or not this landlord is flipping apartments. You know, you need to know if this landlord will give you repairs. So you're gonna have to go on HPD building info and see how many violations this building has. You know, that's what I do when I'm moving. I'm like, where am I moving to? Because I've had bad situations. I one time moved into an apartment and my landlord was like, oh, I'm renovating the whole building, get out. And I'm like, what the hell? So yeah, know your rights, sign your lease, read your lease very well, you know, keep evidence of you paying rent because some landlords will be like, oh, you never paid me rent, get out. So yeah, you and your partner should definitely figure this, be careful. But you know, New York City is a great place. It's a wild place and the housing is wild as well. So, you know, keep your feet, you know, on the ground and be assertive too. Be like, I don't want to pay this. What is this? Like, are you gonna fix this window? You're gonna have to do that. But yeah, that's my advice.
That was so scary.
Just real talk, so.
And just to let you guys know, we have these your rights as a New York City tenant handouts as well on the table. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I was curious, where, because there's always a community or percentage of the population that gets lost in between like the affordable subsidized and then the market rate. And, you know, we with OFA have worked a lot on the Affordable Care Act and New York State put in the essential plan because there was a gap from the people that could apply for Medicaid expansion versus the people that could actually afford a monthly premium, and the state realized that, okay, there's a gap. But I don't see it, like, I was wondering, does the state realize there's that gap for housing as well? My aunt fell into that. She lived in New York City for over 30 years. She paid New York State taxes all those years. She paid her rent. And then, you know, she's a victim of ageism and in the corporate world that they, you know, let her go before she could reach retirement. So then she was in this gap where, you know, we tried everything, like finding a roommate for her after my grandmother died, a lot of things, and she just couldn't make ends meet, and she went to the lottery, but she's not an attractive person for the lottery because she's a single woman, she's not, doesn't have any kids or friends. So, so we had to move her upstate to my parents, and the nice thing about affordable housing up there is there's capacity. There's still, and it's really affordable, so she has the dignity again of being able to provide for herself and not rely on my parents to pay her rent and pay her food and pay. She can have that dignity back. But it's just an interesting lesson that like there's that gap of the people that
And that is where the people in the gap, that's why the homeless rate, right. That's why the homeless rate, and I read an article, I want to say a couple months ago, that talked about the homeless rate now look as it did during the Depression. So, and that's where those individuals are falling, those who can't be on one end or the other.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question. There are gaps all over the place. It's like a right, like Swiss cheese or some sort of leaking boat or something. Yeah, it's interesting to think about it in comparison with the healthcare question, because it's not. You're right. It's not like a particular stripe in the socioeconomic spectrum where there's a gap. Like, the problem is housing in New York isn't really an entitlement for folks based on their income. You've got folks that are eligible for NYCHA or eligible to get a voucher or eligible for any number of these affordable housing units, but because they're all at capacity and they're just not available, there's sort of gaps all over. But I think you're...
It used to be an entitlement. I mean, NYCHA was created because New York City said we have the responsibility to house all of our all of
Amen.
citizens.
Well, and
They don't do it.
obviously this was long before my time. My understanding is that originally it wasn't really thought of as a program for the extremely poor. It was thought of as a program for like middle class folks. You know, we need to house our workers in this city, and this is how we're going to do it efficiently. And it's no longer thought of that way. But I think you're also right. You said your aunt. Her experience is indicative that there's sort of an especially striking problem for single folks, because there really are economies of scale when you can have a roommate or a partner that's also pulling in an income. And even though most of our communities feel most strongly the need for multi-bedroom units that can accommodate families, because that's sort of like the aspirational community that you want. There is a real gap for single individuals also, I think.
Yeah, so I definitely understand how someone, even it starts in the workplace, then you are kind of in limbo. You know, when you're applying to NYCHA or these places, you need to be giving all this information like, I have a family, I have this income, I have this and that. If you don't have that, you're not getting housing. That's a form of discrimination, I feel. Same when you're finding an apartment. They're like, oh, your credit score is bad, you know, or you're on food stamps. I don't want anyone on food stamps here. Yeah, there's definitely major loopholes, and single New Yorkers that have been here for maybe more than 40 years do suffer, who have had, you know, have been making maybe 40 grand a year. You definitely get lost into the system, and you eventually get displaced because of the lack of help that they provide, because they're waiting for you to either crash and burn and help you, or you're in this like spectrum where they care to help. But yeah, I hopefully she filed for a human rights complaint in regards to her employment. But yeah, I used to work at the Human Rights Division for employment, and I've seen a lot of age discrimination. But yeah, a lot of these elderly people are the ones who are homeless and who are single, or they get trapped in these senior housing that is so bad. Yeah, so that's another thing that our politicians need to work on, because they're definitely ignoring that, because you know what, they're not a part of a family, they're not part of like this thing that we care about. So yeah, I definitely feel like we should help those as well.
And I wanted to add, in my own personal situation, with me and my single parent father, my father had really bad credit, and that was one of the, like, so we would keep going to these basically illegal apartments, and then we'd get kicked out of the illegal apartment because it was illegal. So that happened to us twice. You know, we never went through the motions of trying to get into a program, you know, which I think my father was aware of the stresses of trying to do that too. So, okay, I did want to ask, in terms of, like you're saying, like, falling through the gaps, so like you were saying, what is affordable? So tell me, like, what do you think is affordable housing versus how we measure it with AMI? As far as, like, who's eligible for affordable housing, and, like, how can we improve that? How can we improve, like, so we have this measure of who gets affordable housing measured by AMI. Is there a better way to determine who's eligible for affordable housing?
Not measured by AMI? No, seriously, that would be a great start, because AMI includes salaries from one extreme to the next. And that's why we're looking at $66,000 as an AMI in a community that IRS says the average income is 45. So when people come in and they develop, they do AMI. But how are you going, and they said, you know, the community can live there, but you can't. $1,000. And AMI is $66,000. And that's the premise the developer is using. Who in the community is going to be able to live there? They're going to be displaced. Those are the numbers. So pulling out of AMI, and if you're going to develop in a particular area, you take the mean income, and it's easy, all of us can Google it, it's easy to find. You take the mean income of the area, maybe within 2 miles, 3 mile radius, and start there. Doing it in Nassau County and all that, come on. We're in Manhattan, we're in Brooklyn, we're in Queens, really? And that's how we need to start. Just come out of it and do it in a realistic way, not in a way that yields the highest amount of money you can get realistically.
Is that a state law or a city law?
That's the premise that HUD uses. That's HUD, right?
Yeah, I think it's federal government that sets up these areas that you're measuring the median income in.
So federal decided to make this large boundary?
And they do an average.
Even though they have, you know,
Right, and that's,
what you're saying is that
and all of us live in, I'm sorry.
No.
All of us live in different boroughs, and we hear that argument all the time about development wanting to happen in our community, and it's inappropriate, the salary is out of range for individuals that live there. I know we've all heard it, so, and that's why we're hearing it, because it's out of balance. And it creates the kind of vacuum that we're looking at, the home, that we're seeing individuals fall through, that's creating the homeless rate that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's right to say that these median income sort of catchment areas are the product of the federal administration of a lot of these rental programs, and the city and state sort of for their own programs like mandatory inclusionary, sorry about that, like for the mandatory inclusionary housing program or whatever, have just sort of latched on to the numbers the federal government is already using. I mean, I agree that it doesn't make sense in a lot of ways to be effectively overestimating the median incomes for these neighborhoods that we're working in. There's been some push over the last few years to try to address that specifically in the administration of the housing choice vouchers with, I forget what the program is called, but something like small area median rental incomes or something like that. Where the idea is that we'll look at it almost by neighborhood. We'll look at what are rents in Williamsburg, and then vouchers in Williamsburg will pay out at X amount of dollars versus looking at the rents in East New York, and vouchers in East New York will pay out at Y amount. And the idea is coming thus far and not having those breakdowns by neighborhood, the vouchers won't get you into market apartments in Williamsburg. They'll only get you into market apartments in East New York. And so it's become sort of a tool, not a tool, but a factor in perpetuating segregation by income and also by race in cities like New York across the country. And so, you know, by breaking it down into the smaller neighborhoods, we can tweak these programs to better accomplish our fair housing goals.
There's a big problem with the way they obtain this data. They're, first of all, not counting a lot of undocumented people paying rent. That is a huge percent of New York City. I can only imagine how that would change the way they estimated our low income. I would say it would go lower than 40 grand. There's a problem with that, and there's always a big problem with these statistics. There's a lot of people lost. They don't count a lot of people, and again, they don't go into small areas and figure out how much money they're making and how they are struggling. So, the definition of affordable is not yet placed because we have not really looked for it. In ever, I think. That's why we've always had a housing crisis in New York and America itself. There's no affordable right now. People are paying, 80% of their income into rent. If they really ask everyone personally what they're going through and how much money they're putting into rent, we would be getting into the beginning of what is affordable, because these developments that they are building are definitely not affordable in my lens after working here for 2 years. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in. Do you know anything about it? I don't know anything about that.
So this is what I've heard. It might be like this fairy tale, but in Vermont, which is a rural area, so it's easier for them. They actually have a good affordable housing program where they actually help elderly people house them and really, but it's more. I don't want to say easier, that's never easy, but it's a small population. I guess that, but I have not seen anything that is a model thing, except maybe Germany, which is not America. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, New York has a lot of very innovative, very powerful programs and regulations that do a lot to help try to make things more affordable. One of the programs that we make the most use of as housing lawyers is just sort of rental assistance through what are called one-shot deals administered through the Human Resource Administration, where somebody gets behind in rent. The City of New York sort of has this calculation they have for, if this person gets evicted for non-payment of rent, how much are we going to have to pay in order to provide services as new homeless people, versus how much are we willing to pay right now in order to keep them in that apartment. They can afford to pay going forward. They just had a medical bill, or they had a death, or whatever they had, and so they're behind. And so the City of New York is, compared to, as far as I can tell, anywhere else, they are extremely generous on stuff like that. The City of New York will regularly pay out $15,000, $20,000 in rent arrears for folks who get behind but are able to pay going forward. Some different cities just have different angles on the problems they're trying to address. Boston is another place where I've done housing stuff, and their laws around, but New York's got a lot. It's just there are also a lot of hurdles that we're trying to overcome. Everybody wants to be here, and there's just not enough.
Yeah, and from what I've read, New York's considered one of the more progressive cities with affordable housing. So that might frighten you. Any more questions?
I have one more. My mind goes to this, maybe you could address this. Isn't the issue, and we don't have a developer representing themselves, I guess, but isn't part of the issue the market cost of property, and then developers need to make money? So would you, so sort of a two-part question, address that, and is one option just public housing that's paid for entirely by the government?
First question again?
Well, addressing the issue of the market cost of property. So it takes a lot of money to purchase property and then to make profit off of
Are you
residents.
saying that contributes to the huge cost of apartments?
Well, I'm
You were
asking
thinking that?
what you think about that.
I'm not a developer or a real estate person, but given the prices that I've seen on some of these apartments, I think most of that is greed. Especially since apartments are smaller than they were back in the day. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a pre-war apartment. They're huge. Yeah, they're huge. And when we look at apartments now and we listen to developers speak, and that's something else you'll hear when you go to a ULURP, they'll tell you how many apartments they're trying to get per square foot, the size of each apartment. They're putting as many apartments as they can in as small a space as they can, and it's about making money. How many apartments can they get to yield profit? It's not necessarily to pay for property, it's to yield profit. You understand? So, no, I don't think it's the cost. I think it's just the greed, but that's just me. And what's the second question? Can you repeat the second question?
Should we just do all public housing?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, because look, where we are right now, public housing has fallen into disrepair because it's been neglected. People do not see the value, like you mentioned earlier, the value that it brought to a community that was in need of housing. That value that it brought to the community was ignored. They were like, okay, they looked at it as the population that's not really paying rent, so they overlooked them. Some of the NYCHA buildings have gone in such disrepair that they need to redo them, the entire building. They need to redo them. And I think if they were a market rate building, they would not have been ignored in that way. Not to say they should be market. Not saying that. Not saying that. But all housing should not be NYCHA. It shouldn't be. Because of how people regard something that appears to be inexpensive. Notice I said appears to be inexpensive to the consumer, and we are the consumer. That's all.
Thank you.
Yo.
Okay, I want to take a stab at that question too, but I want to hear your question, and then I'll try to answer both at the same time.
Because I thought this earlier, and feedback after your remarks. Is there any truth to the rumor that because the NYCHA buildings are some of the largest real estate in New York, that they're attempting to get rid of all low-paying residents so that they can convert them to condominiums and
Are there like long-term plans and sort of secret smoke-filled back rooms? I would never put that past anybody. I think that sounds to me like sort of the telephone game result of what I think is called the next generation NYCHA program, which is the idea that NYCHA, you have to, it makes a couple of assumptions or conclusions in order to get what it does. But one, NYCHA is disastrously underfunded, like we all know. Two, NYCHA has assets, aside from just its buildings that people are living in, that are being underutilized to greater or lesser extents. These are all built, these were built at a time where we had different conceptions about how much open space you wanted to have around tall buildings. And so there's just a lot of open space that's generally being underutilized. And so the idea is to look at what assets NYCHA has and what of these can we sell off or lease off in order to get some more money, in order to repair the public housing, in order to preserve the public housing such as it is.
But what's contributing to that rumor is the fact that in other areas, the open spaces, streets are being closed to create open spaces, where with NYCHA, buildings are being placed in those open spaces. That's what's contributing to that rumor.
Like not far from here at a development called Cooper Park, there is a plan in the works to put some partially market, partially affordable housing on what is now a parking lot. And that is being opposed by the surrounding community, including by the public housing development. I honestly don't know in depth what their opposition is, what their arguments are. I think they've probably got some good points. I think, you know, I don't know, but no, I don't believe the plan is to get rid of the public housing buildings and put market housing in its place. I believe the plan is get rid of some of the empty land and put market housing on that. And then just on this point, it's such a good question, and it's such a hard question, which is the real reason why we haven't solved it yet. I think you'd have to be crazy not to observe that the costs of building in New York are very high relative to some other cities. Even just getting through
Construction costs are higher here than anywhere else in the world.
Right, and you guys saw that. Well, it's a lot of different reasons. You saw the article looking at our cost per mile on the Second Avenue subway or whatever, and we say, oh, you know, New York's a really old city, and oh, we got a lot of underground infrastructure. But like you compare it to Rome or something, and Rome's got 3 millennia of like history that needs to be immaculately preserved under its streets, and they can build a mile subway for half the cost or a quarter of the cost or something bizarre. And so it's very expensive to develop here for reasons that are beyond me. But it has to do in part with the really rigorous land use review procedure, the Euler procedure that we have. I mean, in order to get a zoning change and build, you know, at 20 stories rather than at 5 stories, you got to jump through these hoops of the community board and at the borough president and at the city council. You got to pay your consultants in order to make the arguments for you and to, you know, sweet talk all the city council members. And so there are a lot of issues. I do think there's greed involved. I think they want to make the profit as much as they can, obviously. I also think that at every stage of its affordable housing program development, back from when they were like inventing rent control, it's been a balancing act between what are we going to do in order to protect folks that are living in our city, and how do we need to sort of restrict this program so that we don't overstep and disincentivize developers from ever building. Because that's certainly not the answer to say we've got enough housing, we don't want to build any more. We want the private sector to be adding to our unit totals so that, you know, insofar as supply and demand is affecting this, our supply is going up and thus the price is coming down. I don't know what the answer is, but I spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah, developers, we have to deal with them a lot. They are people with money, and when our mayor sees the money and sees that this will, you know, create affordable housing, he just lets it go. They don't really see who this developer is and what his intentions are. You know, how is he building this affordable, like, you know, building? They let these developers do this cheaply and, you know, I don't know if you guys think these buildings are pretty, but quite ugly buildings in Brooklyn, and, you know, just house as much as people as possible and then get their profit. They don't really care about anyone around them, the, you know, infrastructure. They are building in areas that could create large flooding. And the city isn't really, you know, looking at what are the impacts of these massive buildings. developers they could do whatever they want. But in regards to your second part question, which was, you said, does everyone should be in affordable housing, or?
Just, it seems like the total extreme would be, solving a lot of problems would be just to have government housing like they do in a lot of other countries, especially Eastern Europe, other places.
Yes, they have a different population, but I guess Roosevelt tried to do this back in the day. Today, it's a little harder than that. In regards to NYCHA, they have definitely isolated NYCHA residents, not really cared about the changes that are happening around them and what they could afford. They go to the supermarket now and they can't really get things that they're used to getting back in the day. So yeah, they're not only not funding NYCHA, they're also ignoring the residents and how their community has changed around them. And they're isolating them to a point where they're leaving and they're tired. And they think that that New York City secretly wants them out, which I think they're not doing it intentionally, but they're ignoring their needs. And, how long can you be ignored for? I think that a community where everyone cares about people who live in their apartments and live a nice life, that would be nice. Not everything could be, under governmental regime, which is another political problem, but I would think that having more affordable housing for everybody would be great. But American politics would probably call me like a socialist, but it would be great to see that, and I agree. It would be a nice idea to have such a housing initiative, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm sure it would be mismanaged all the how, as it already is, but it's interesting to speculate as to what would happen if you, switched our HUD and Defense Department budgets. What would be possible? I don't know.
I'm going to pretend to be a panelist for a second. I also had this realization after this whole project that my personal opinion is that the Department of Defense funding is the problem here. And then, anyway, I also just wanted to chime in that as far as the newer affordable housing programs that were introduced under de Blasio and under Bloomberg are more private market based. So there's kind of like a rejection of public housing, partially because of the lack of funding coming from the federal government, and maybe partially because of popular ideologies, whatever, there's some kind of formula, but the new programs are developers build and a certain percentage goes to affordable housing, and that's very debatable, how that affects the neighborhood, because you could argue that even if you get that 25% affordable housing in that building, the other 75% will dramatically change that neighborhood, and then people can't afford to go shopping in that neighborhood anymore if they're low income. So anyway, okay, so last question.
I know, it's
Yeah.
just a very interesting topic. I need to eat. She's kicking me, but it's just what you're saying made me think it's a change of what Americans feel that they're entitled to, right? Because I'm going to go back to an analogy of the ACA because I've done so much work with that, but that attitude has really shifted even in the last year. I'm like, I'm entitled to better affordable health care. We're not going to go backwards now as if it would be
this will be our last question, so any final words as well? Feel free to.
You don't want to?
I agree with you, but it's, I think a lot of our citizens feel that regardless of what they say, no one's going to listen, you know, and in that is when I usually fall back on, am I my brother's keeper? So there are those of us who use our voice, which is, and D would be here. And we look at individuals who just feel disenfranchised. They go, well, it doesn't matter. No one's going to listen to me. And we are individuals who use our voices. All of us in this room, we use our voices. If we didn't, we wouldn't be in this room. So we have to remember to support them because, believe it or not, if there isn't a HECO in the room, they are going to be looked over. And so we will have some housing that is below par and some housing that is great. And it's all or nothing, in all honesty, because we're looking at NYCHA suffering right now. And we're watching it and we're going, oh my God, that's so bad. But what could we do? And it's not just for those of us who live in NYCHA, it's for everyone to support. Because one thing that really happens is individuals see that they can get away with something over there. They'll try to get away with it over here. So, and that's why we all need to chime in, you know? So, that's my opinion.
I think, I'm as a professional housing advocate, I obviously agree. I would love for like housing to become a national issue of like on a level of what healthcare has been over the last several years. That would be, I would feel very relevant. I think one of the things that perhaps makes it more difficult, although maybe there are complications like this in the healthcare market that I'm just not aware of, but housing is so local. Obviously it's like fixed right there in the ground. It's got like a GPS coordinate. And the different city regulatory schemes, the different state regulatory schemes, and the different, amounts of funding and all these different, like the problems are just very different actually in a place. Like if you look at New York City and what's happening in New York City versus someplace like, I don't know, Detroit or wherever, where there's, some places have more of a problem with vacant and dilapidated housing than they do with the sort of desperate need for more housing that we've got right here. And so who knows what like the one-size-all solution would look like. That said, there are things that it seems like a national campaign could address. One of those that's come up in the news recently with respect to the tax reform is the mortgage interest tax deduction that homeowners get for their first and second homes. This tax write-off that homeowners get, these homeowners who have this equity, and this is something that they can sort of hold on to relative to lowly renters like us, they get this massive tax write-off that amounts to a de facto subsidy by the federal government that dwarfs all the rental subsidies that we give to low-income people. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but when you look at them, you think, oh, this seems like these numbers seem too high. It seems like we're spending too much money in giving these tax write-offs to homeowners. That's not a very popular opinion in like New Jersey or whatever, where there are a lot of homeowners, but it is pretty popular in Brooklyn, actually. So, I don't know, we can advocate on issues like that.
Well, what I tell my clients all the time is, housing is a basic human right. We need that to move on with everything else we have during our lives. It's where we eat, where we, have kids, where, I just think that that's the first thing you should have. And the things that have been happening throughout our history has not been okay because we have failed to provide this one basic human right. And I am actually happy that a lot of people are realizing that they're realizing and fighting and feeling that what is going on is not okay. And that initial feeling is the start of you know, people actually making solutions that actually work. You know, sustaining our affordable housing now and making it right and ethical. But yeah, I do wish that, you know, this housing crisis gets to a higher point of visibility and concern, because again, it is what we think about when we leave work is, where am I going? I'm going home. You know, so just giving people that, maybe they would have better progress with the other issues that they have to tackle with being a low-income American, you know, citizen or not. It's always a struggle, but yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to my wonderful colleagues, Molly, Alex, and Chris, and Amanda, who's not here. Applause for Amanda. She also worked very hard. And thanks for all of you for coming. We'll take these handouts if you want. There'll also be, we'll add this slideshow to the Facebook group, and if you write down your email on that, we'll send it to you.